So the centrepiece of this year's budget is that reform of the tax system planned over 7 years or so. Robert Deutsch is a senior counsel at the Tax Institute and spent last night poring over the new measures in the budget lockup, and he joins me now from Canberra. Robert Deutsch, looking fresh despite the fact of being in that budget for lockup for so long. What do you think of this overall plan to flatten the tax rates? Pretty ambitious.
Well, it is very ambitious, but it's been a difficult process, I think, for the government to work out exactly how they're going to do it. Immediately, there's going to be some small benefits starting 1 July 2018, so that's just around the corner. There'll be a low and middle income tax offset of some $530, and in addition, there'll be an adjustment to the rate at which the 37% rate cuts in, a very small adjustment, taking it up from $87,000 to $90,000. But longer term, there will be much bigger benefits for taxpayers, and eventually, but that's eventually means 2023-24, there'll be some substantial changes to personal tax rates. But remember, that is at least 2 federal elections away. So. There's a bit to get through before we get those bigger benefits.
Yeah, there is. But we'll discuss that in a moment. But what do you think about the government actually setting this out as a goal now? Why do you believe it's a good thing that Australia has a flatter tax system?
Well, I think it is a good thing. I've advocated for some time that we need to reduce the brackets. We've had 5 for some time. The government's plan is to eventually reduce them to 4, and I think that's a good thing. The one thing that I would question is the very lengthy proposed bracket from 40,000 up to 200,000. That actually took me quite by surprise. I wasn't expecting such a long bracket at which the 32.5% rate is going to apply. I would have thought that that should be a narrower bracket, keeping the 4 levels that they're proposing, 0, 19, 32.5 and 45, but making that bracket from 40 to 200 a little smaller. And that could be done in a number of ways. It certainly leaves the government open to the argument that somebody on 45,000 and somebody on 199,000 will be paying the same marginal tax rate, which doesn't seem entirely fair in a progressive tax system.
Yeah, so why should that be narrowed? Just go into, I know you've just mentioned it there, but just go into a bit more detail why you think that that bracket should be narrower.
Well, it just doesn't seem right in a progressive system that somebody who's on a very modest income of $45,000, I would call that relatively modest, versus somebody who is on a pretty substantial income, $199,000, should be paying the same amount of tax on each additional dollar that they're getting at that point. Now, admittedly, the one on 199,000, when they hit 200,000, will start paying 45%. But until they get there, they're going to be paying the same rate on each additional dollar as the person who is on $41,000. That just doesn't seem right, that it should be the same rate when you've got such disparity in income at those points.
So how do you believe it should be adjusted?
Well, I would have thought that there would be some argument to, well, there's a number of possibilities. One would be to bring up the cut-in point for the 32.5% rate instead of 40,000, perhaps taking that up to 60,000. Or you could bring down the rate at which the 45% rate cuts in. The original, the one we've got at the moment, is that cuts in at 180,000. The government is obviously trying to take that up a little bit. And I think in some ways that's a good thing, but I would have thought the better way to approach it is to have a higher point at which the 37% rate, or the 32.5% rate cuts in should be higher than 40,000.
So how will Australia rate in terms of tax rate and a flatter tax system internationally if this gets through?
Well, our rates are still pretty high. There's no question about that. And really, if you take into account the Medicare levy, which in many ways is nothing other than an additional income tax, our top rate is still going to be 47%. That compares very unfavourably with most of our competitors. If you look around the globe, New Zealand, United States, United Kingdom, they're all going to have lower top personal tax rates. I actually think that's a very bad thing for Australia. I think our rate, ideally, our rate should be closer to 30%, our top rate. That's not going to happen in our lifetimes, I don't think, certainly not mine. but a rate closer to 40%, a top rate closer to 40% inclusive of the Medicare levy, should be about as high as our top personal rate should be. So I think it remains fairly uncompetitive at the personal tax level.
And what do you make of the economic assumptions around this? Is this going to be doable in 7 years?
Well, I think it's going to be quite expensive. Again, I come back to that 40,000 to 200,000 bracket that is going to be taxed at 32.5%. That bracket currently is taxed in part at 37% and in part at 45%. Actually, tinkering with these rates is quite expensive. The economic assumptions, I think, I'm not an economist by training, but they look reasonable to me. And I think that the government is trying to claw back a lot of income through measures dealing with the black economy, etc. And I think there'll be some success there. But if there's not, the government won't be able to deliver on these substantial tax reductions in global terms without creating a bigger budget deficit.
And you sounded hesitant about this 7-year plan. Do you think it should have been a shorter plan, and so the government would be committed to it earlier, or aren't these things so substantial that you need time to roll them out?
Well, I think you do need time, but I think a 7-year plan in political terms is not really feasible. As I mentioned earlier, there are at least 2 federal elections to go before this becomes a reality, certainly the bigger part of the proposal, which isn't slated to happen until 2023-24. I think most people will regard this as pie in the sky stuff, hopeful, but they don't know whether it'll ever be delivered. And I think that's probably the right approach to take, because with 2 elections in between, lots of things can happen, and the only thing that I think people can count on is the changes that are likely to happen, or that will be happening on 1 July 2018, which are those two measures that I mentioned earlier. They're the only things that I think are certain to happen. The rest of it, I think we have to wait and see.
Yeah, and although the government is saying at this stage it's not going to split the legislation, and Labor is saying it supports those initial tax initiatives but not the rest of them, so we'll see how that pans out. Robert Deutsch, thanks so much for talking to us this morning from Canberra.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.